First, before we get started with, I want to thank our sponsors, which include the Greater Columbus Arts Council, the Ohio Arts Council, White Castle, Columbus Foundation, UBS, the Japan Foundation, and our other festival sponsors. So let's give a round of applause for our sponsors. And so you're here for the spotlight on Denis Kitchen. Denis Kitchen's career runs from the underground comics of the 1960s and 70s through the independent comics movement of the 1980s to today. During that span, he has been an artist, publisher, agent, and tireless advocate for creators. So with this panel, we have 40 minutes for the spotlight discussion that Denis and I are going to have, and then 10 minutes for questions. So I feel we can pretty much cover that whole career in the time we have. We can't, obviously. So let's. I want to start. One of the things, just as a kind of almost side note to start out with, that from reading your biography in the recent collection of your work, that you got for your first exposure to comic books was through your babysitter, and I find that's one thing we share. My babysitter, when I was like 5 or 6, had a stack of Richie Rich and Archie comics, and that was my gateway. So maybe anybody marketing comics out there, get them in the hands of babysitters might be the way to start.
That's the entry drug.
Let's see. So, got some slides here. These aren't in any particular order. This was working a minute ago. There we go. Okay. I'm going to start out with that slide, but I'm not going to run through the entire career, of course, but I do want to start with Mom's Homemade Comics, which is your first work. So when you were first producing Mom's Homemade Comics in Milwaukee, right? Yeah. Were you aware of the growing underground comics movement in other cities like San Francisco or Chicago?
Not at all. It was done in a vacuum. It was supposed to be the humor college magazine I had co-founded, but my co-founder ran off with the Snide magazine's treasury. So I decided I would just do it on my own. So what would have been the second issue of Snide became Mom's #1, and that title was just really to set up the subtitle, which was Straight from the Kitchen to You. And I also realized I kind of blew the line because it should have said octopi, right? Instead of octopus pie. Anyway.
So what about that first experience put you on the path into becoming a publisher?
Yeah, it was never an aspiration to be a publisher. I probably couldn't have defined what a publisher was when I did that, but I had a kind of a natural instinct for business. So I did what a lot of cartoonists either aren't willing to do or don't know how to do. I hustled it. I was able to print 4,000. That's what my life savings at the time covered. And I went to every potential outlet on the east side of Milwaukee where I lived, and it was the head shops, the used bookstores, the corner druggist, anybody I knew, and they said, local guy, can I put 25 on your counter, come back in a couple weeks? And everyone was happy to help a local artist. And in one summer, I sold 3,000 copies just on the east side of Milwaukee. And 500 got shipped to San Francisco, and 500, one of my roommates took to Woodstock, where he promised to sell them and bring back a lot of money. But as you know from Woodstock, they couldn't park anywhere near the festival, so he and a friend were schlepping this heavy box of comics, and by the time they got to the festival, I think they had dropped acid and they decided they should just give them away. So, so 500 hippies got my comic, and so that was the start.
Are they like still digging up copies of Mom's on the farm out there?
You know, that's probably the fate of most of them.
To kind of skip ahead a bit, I've also, when I was working on the Howard Cruz book, I ended up going into your papers that are at Columbia University, which I think if anybody's interested in the history of underground comics in general, it's just incredible, and happen to be in New York City and can get a chance to check them out. It's an incredible archive, and one of the things I noticed in your letters is kind of how you were responding to different kind of ups and downs in the underground market at the time. So what for you were, in looking back, were some of the kind of key events that shifted the underground market from, either in a positive or a negative way?
Well, remember that when I and my cohort started what we now call underground comics, there was no system of distribution. We created it ourselves. I had actually, the same year I co-founded Kitchen Sink and Krupp, as it was also known. I co-founded an alternative paper in Wisconsin. And when you were a member of the Underground Press Syndicate, as they called it, an obligation was you had to send your paper to the other members, and I think there were 60 or 70 or so. And so our paper got all the comps from all over the country, and most of the staff members didn't care to look through them except casually, but I would go through, clip out all the ads for every head shop, every used bookstore, every place that might be an outlet, and that's how I built my mailing list that became a distribution company we call Krupp Distribution. And we had to invent it all, because today you have, of course, Diamond Comics and others. There's a network. You have comic shops. There were no comic shops when I started. These were the really prehistoric days. So by relying largely on head shops, because they, like us, were kind of an outlaw entity, we thrived or didn't thrive on the health of that head shop market. And at a certain point, they came under fire. I think some of you remember Art Linkletter had a daughter who fell out of a window, allegedly tripping. And suddenly the talk shows and things focused on the fact that children were falling out of windows because of drugs, and so nobody wanted a head shop in their neighborhood. And steadily the shops got closed down and our distribution network diminished. And so that was the first real crisis. Fortunately, about that same time, comic shops started to appear. And that was our salvation, because a lot of those guys were kindred spirits. And so one kind of led into the other, not with a plan, but by happenstance.
Now, was the Art Linkletter's daughter story affecting head shops, was that around the same time as the Miller versus California Supreme Court decision?
I'd have to look up the date, but I mean, there are a number of things that were problems. I mean, the case you referred to was 1973, when the Supreme Court decided that obscenity should be thrown back to local communities. So the idea was, if you were in, say, New York City, you would have a different standard than Podunk, Kansas, or whatever. But that didn't really help. It made things murkier, and at the same time, these head shops who were under fire started calling themselves tobacco shops, because, of course, you buy this hookah or bong, you're going to put tobacco in it. And that was the official excuse. But if you also had a rack of comics that said Furry Freak Brothers and Dope Comics and so on, it made it harder to defend your tobacco shop status. And so the easiest thing for them was to stop carrying comics.
I'm wondering, because soon after that too is the Air Pirates case as well, and I know a lot, and I've got up here a Nancy parody that you had in one of the Air Pirates. One of the effects of the Air Pirates case seemed to be a kind of chilling effect on people doing like parodies that so closely resembled the original. I know Howard Cruz was doing a lot of that stuff and was really, really good at it. But it also seemed to be a kind of staple of underground comics in general, not just Dan O'Neill.
It was, because we were largely inspired by Harvey Kurtzman and the early Mad and Humbug and Trump and Help, all the magazines that Kurtzman and his amazing crew did. So yeah, like that's an example of, I love Nancy, and it was fun to, it was easy to make fun of. The Air Pirates mistake was they didn't learn from Harvey. His theory was, if you're going to satirize someone, you hit once, hit hard, and then you stop. The Air Pirates put out 2 issues. They also took icons like Mickey and Minnie, put them in X-rated situations. And Disney's not a corporation you mess with. Disney had to sue. And so if they had just done 1 issue, I think it would have flown under the radar.
Yeah, this is from, I can't remember which issue of Snarf this is in, but there's a whole series that you and I think Pete Poplawski did of some great newspaper strip parodies. And so getting back to Snarf, let's see, whoops, I'm going the wrong direction. Now with Kitchen Sink, you put out anthologies like Snarf and Bizarre Sex and Death Rattle and so on.
Yeah, Dope Comics.
Yeah, and all of which were kind of thematically focused, right? Snarf
Right.
was a humor comic, and the others I think kind of speak for themselves. So when kind of coming up with one of these anthologies, was it that you were getting like a kind of preponderance of submissions to you that were on those topics that you thought, maybe I'll put together an anthology on this topic, or did you come up with the theme or topic first and then solicit?
Yeah, I think it was the latter. I think I just decided, we needed a horror anthology, for example. But it was also keeping in mind that there was certain talent that had a propensity for it, or perhaps had said, hey, I'd like to do a horror story. Have you got a place for it? So it was a combination. I can't say there was ever a master plan. I think Bizarre Sex came up because I just thought, I need something that sells well. What will sell well? Bizarre Sex. And it worked. So.
I've always wondered that because, like, for example, with Howard Cruz's Barefoots, you could find it in Snarf, but you could also find it in Bizarre Sex. And so how did the decision go where Barefoots went?
I mean, Howard would do things, as cute as his style was, superficially it was super cute, but, he had sometimes a raunchy sense of humor, and that was the right place to put it.
Let's see. So I want to then shift ahead a little. Well, one of the interesting things I've always found about Snarf and Bizarre Sex and Death Rattle in particular is that they kind of survived the underground movement, and so you end up seeing some of the best of the earliest independent comics coming out of there, like Zoic Tales and
yeah.
So there seemed to be some connection. I feel like there's some connection there between their survival, their longevity, and the appeal of their thematic focus.
Yeah, they also lasted long enough that a new generation of cartoonists started to make appearances in the last of the undergrounds. Joe Matt, who just died, comes to mind, made his debut in Snarf, and we did the first Peep Show. So, I mean, I was just looking for good talent. It was always, use a term like underground comics, independent, alternative. They merge a lot, but certainly you can identify on a chart, which of the younger guys got their debut in undergrounds and then went on to have a great career.
Well, since you mentioned Joe Matt, I've got the first volume of Peep Show that you published up here, and since his death is pretty fresh for all of us, and one of the interesting things kind of following the announcement of his passing were all the stories people were have told about Joe Matt. Do you have any, since you were the first, I think Snarf is the first place Peep Show showed up, right? So since you were the first one, first of all, what attracted you to publishing Joe's stuff?
I just thought he was very funny, very quirky. I would say my favorite story, he was notoriously cheap. We published a poster by him called How to Be Cheap. And I was, first time I visited him in Toronto, we were walking down the sidewalk, and he was looking down. I mean, like literally looking down. And suddenly he stopped, reached down, picked up a dime, and he said, "This is why I always look down when I walk." True story.
Yeah, and those, I mean, if people aren't familiar with, I don't have a picture up of those early Joe Matt strips, but they're one page, but they're like
very dense,
40 or 50 panels per page.
Yeah, that was one of the things I thought was great. He compressed so much on a single page.
Yeah, and so, was he at that early stage, hard to get kind of on deadline or getting to produce stuff?
My recollection is he was pretty reliable.
Yeah.
I think as he got older, he got much slower, and of course, to some people, he's a controversial figure because he was so honest. He had a lot in common with Crumb. He would just do a comic about anything, however painful it was to himself or his girlfriends. It's painful often to read his work, but I do think it's important work.
Okay, so jumping back to kind of where we were, at some point in the 70s, according to your biography, you were kind of seriously considering getting out of publishing and going back to art, and you went to Will Eisner and Harvey Kurtzman to let them know about this, and Harvey Kurtzman's response to you was really interesting to me, about that he argued with you that there's an art to publishing. In your career, how did that art of publishing come to be defined for you, or the artistic?
Well, good question. I started as a cartoonist, and I certainly intended to be a full-time cartoonist, but publishing became virtually a full-time job, and I think at first I resented it because it was taking me away from the drawing board, but I realized that being a publisher was kind of like, maybe being the conductor of an orchestra rather than playing the violin. And so I tried to be as creative as possible, certainly in editing and putting together the anthologies, trying to attract talent, encouraging people. I love discovering fresh faces. So, yeah, in the 80s, I really had soured on the whole idea of publishing, and so I went to see my two mentors, as you said, and I knew that Harvey, I thought, would be easy because he was a pure artist, and Eisner was, some of you may know, a really savvy businessman besides being an artist. And so I thought Eisner would give me a hard time, but Harvey would bless my decision, and it turned out to be the exact opposite. Will Eisner was he said, follow your heart. That's what you want to do. He said, I'll find another publisher. But Harvey said, don't you dare stop. He said, we need good publishers. And he said to me, cartoonists are a dime a dozen. And he said, I don't mean to diminish cartoonists, but he said, we need good publishers. And I remember flying back and going over and over in my mind, and he persuaded me. So for better or worse, I continued.
Well, yeah, I think we're all grateful for that. What do you think? But what do you think makes? I mean, Harvey's saying that it's a rare thing, right? So what do you think makes that?
But keep in mind that Harvey and Will both came from a generation where virtually every publisher was a sleaze. You look at the beginning of the industry in the mid-30s, certainly into the 40s and much of the 50s. These were not nice guys who ran comics publishing. They totally exploited the talent. Everybody knows about Siegel and Schuster and Superman. That's just one famous example. Even Harvey Kurtzman himself, he created Mad, totally responsible for Mad, but he didn't own it. Bill Gaines was about as good a publisher you'd find in those days, but he was very paternalistic and wasn't about to give equity to creators. So there were no role models for. My generation was the first to react against that comic code authority that we hated. I mean, early on, I had no idea what the politics were behind it, but we just knew that they had transformed these kind of creepy, scary comics we grew up into kind of, lamer comics. We didn't understand why. And so my generation was absolutely determined to do the comics we wanted. Nobody was going to tell us what to do. So there was no role model then for a publisher in that kind of a circumstance where first the artist kept the copyrights, the artist kept the original artwork, the artists were paid a royalty, not a flat rate. So if you sold more comics, you made more money. All those things were brand new concepts. And I couldn't look to anyone else for a role model, so I just tried to apply the golden rule. I had a bad experience with a San Francisco publisher when I first started, and I didn't feel the accounting was right, and I just remember thinking, all right, if I'm going to be a publisher, I want to make sure artists are paid properly, paid on time, just treated fairly. It's a golden rule. And again, amazingly, there was no role model for that. Publishing was a notoriously dirty business.
Yeah, in going through your papers too, I was surprised to see that you didn't even do contracts early on with creators, right?
Not until Will Eisner forced me. When I first met him and I asked him if I could reprint The Spirit, and we had conversations, and it led to what I thought was a deal, a handshake. And he said, well, send me a contract and we'll wrap this up. And I said, well, we don't do contracts, Mr. Eisner. And he said, well, I don't work with anyone where I don't get a contract. And so I tried to rationalize my position, and each time he shot it down. He would say, I believe you, and your handshake is good, but he said, if you get hit by a bus tomorrow or I do, how are our widows going to know what our handshake was? He said it needs to be in writing, it needs to be formal, and a contract protects both parties if it's a good contract. And he kind of wore me down, and finally at the end I said, well, I'll be honest with you, I don't want to pay a lawyer to. And he said, neither do I, I'll write the contract. So, first case of a cartoonist forcing a contract on a publisher.
And did that become your practice from then on, or was it just with Eisner?
Once I realized it did make sense, because inevitably there are misunderstandings with people. You know, you think you said something, somebody else thinks you said something else. So I realized it was just good business. So I began doing it as a regular habit. And some of the underground guys never, I mean, I never had a written contract with Crumb, for example. He just said, nah, okay, because I knew his word was good and vice versa. But it probably became a standard for the vast majority.
There's a lot of kind of like famous stories around you that get told over and over again about like how you met Will Eisner and introduced him to underground comics and things like that, and the creation of Comics Book, which I have up here. So I don't want to kind of repeat a lot of the stories that other people may have heard, but I do want to touch on Comics Book because I feel like that's a really important point in kind of the history of underground comics and your own work as a publisher. So I've got here the little cartoon you did about how you and Stan Lee, who looks a lot like J. Jonah Jameson,
right?
His picture.
That's right.
Got together on Comics Book. So could you talk a little bit about not just Comics Book, but maybe how important Comics Book or its kind of impact on that era of underground comics?
Well, it came at a time, 1973, which we refer to as the crash of '73, as it was at that time when the head shops were starting to stop carrying comics, and the same time as that Supreme Court case. Prior to that, I had had a strange kind of pen pal relationship with Stan Lee, because when I self-published Mom's #1, I had the temerity to send him a copy and a short letter, because I was a fan of those early Marvels. And he sent a nice handwritten note back, and of course I answered, and he answered. And in those days, evidently he had the time, and took a liking to me, and he started offering me jobs, which I would have jumped at maybe a little earlier, but at a time when I had my own business, I was like, I got to see this through. And I didn't want to move to New York. Didn't really want to work for Marvel, but I liked Stan. So after turning him down several times, in 1973, he called again and said, I suppose you still don't want to work for me. And I said, well, I don't know, let's talk. So he flew me to New York, and basically I said, look, I'll put together an experimental magazine, but here are what I think are the conditions for the artists that I work with, and it includes we keep our own copyright, we keep our own art to begin with, and transparent accounting. Stan had just become publisher. Martin Goodman, who had been the publisher at Marvel for its entire existence, had retired. So Stan was kind of a green publisher, and he agreed to my conditions, oddly enough, without thinking of the ramifications. So once we had, I think, the first 3 issues out, and word got around, obviously, like the bullpen guys who had been with him forever, and they were like, why are you giving these long-haired guys a special deal? And we don't get to keep our art, and why do they get to keep their copyright? And one reason was, if you're doing Spider-Man, it has to be owned by the company. We weren't doing house characters. That was my argument. But still, it was kind of a Pandora's box, and he couldn't shut it, so he shut down the magazine. And I already had 2 in the can, and I said, well, what's going to happen to those? And he said, oh, you can publish those. So, I mean, he was very good and generous in my experience, but obviously not the savviest publisher.
So do you think, I mean, it was a few more years after that where Marvel started to finally return art to art. Do you think that set the...
Well, I can't say for sure, but certainly I think it was, we broke the old rules in a way that it was hard for them to rationalize the old policy, especially with art. With copyrights, it made sense. It's an assembly line, so everyone knows it's work for hire. But just treating people fairly, and the fact that they finally developed a sort of a royalty system, not what I'd call a proper one, but they eventually followed what I'd call the underground model.
Mm-hmm. I think with the time left, there's a couple of we talked about Joe Matt. There's a couple of other creators that I want to mention. Howard, first of all, since that's close to me too, and the beginning of gay comics, and how that also got started. But one of the things that struck me in reading your papers, and specifically reading your letters with Howard, was that they're both, you had a really long correspondence. Like the letters are pretty extensive. Whereas if I look at the letters between like you and Will Eisner, they were very like kind of business-like. This is what we're doing, just a couple paragraphs. The letters with Howard were really long and going over kind of the the details of the business and work and your feelings about comics in general at the time. So I guess could you talk a little bit about your relationship with Howard as both a kind of publisher, friend, and now?
Well, again, one of the things, I think the cool things about my experience, maybe my generation, was first, it's the pre-digital age. Keep that in mind. So this correspondence he's talking about, it's not email. These are letters you mail, you wait, you mail back. And according to Karen Green, the librarian at Columbia, I wrote 60,000 letters, which I never would have guessed. But this is what I, just typing. And I never took typing in high school, so I'm typing basically very fast with 2 fingers. If I had only taken a typing class, I would have been a far more productive publisher. But what would develop even from long distance is friendships. A lot of these artists, it took me years before I met them in person. When I first was in touch with Howard, I was in Wisconsin, he was in Alabama. And these letters often got very personal. And so being a publisher wasn't as simple as just getting something printed and distributed and sending a check to the artist. There were relationships, and it was integral. And as a consequence, there were loyalty. I mean, it seemed somebody like Will Eisner, except for the time Jim Warren stole them for a couple of years, he was completely loyal to Kitchen Sink when he could have been published by anyone. But there was a relationship, and so that's eternal, I mean, that doesn't matter what era it is, but I think it was more common because I think the whole underground comics thing was held together by a kind of a generational self-identity. It was like, we don't want to work for the man, to use a cliche. And we were all about social equity, and we were all, with a handful of exceptions, on the progressive side of politics. And those were bonding elements that I don't think you typically see in the larger, more impersonal industry.
Do you see that as a part of what we were talking about earlier, as the art of publishing, building those relationships and loyalties?
Well, in retrospect, yes. At the time, I was just trying to do the right thing, and if you're friends with someone, you're also more likely to be especially attentive to not just the accounting, because nobody was making a lot of money then, and so what money there was, they needed as quickly as possible. And if you knew somebody was, just getting married, just had a child, whatever, you'd be extra attentive and try to get them more work, try to push harder, tell the distributors, this was the greatest comic ever. I mean, whatever trick there was, you would utilize because these were friendships.
When I was telling people I was going to do this talk with you, a lot of works came up that people had. There were favorites of theirs that you published, especially later on. Kitchen Sink started Charles Burns' Black Hole, and The Crow came up a lot. But since this is my time, the series I want to mention as we kind of wrap up is Mark Schultz's Cenozoic Tales, which was one of my favorites at the time, and one I know there's been a recent collection of these that have been put out that I've been revisiting lately and really enjoy. So how did Cenozoic Tales come to you, and what was your kind of initial reaction to Schultz's work?
I think it was 1986, if I recall right, and all publishers get unsolicited submissions. We call it the slush pile, and at least 90% is just too amateurish, too inappropriate, you name it. But there's always enough that I would always have my editorial team and I would go over and, tell that person if they fix their lettering a little bit and this and that, we'll talk further. But one day, Mark Schultz's package came in the mail, and instantly it was like way above the average submission. And I found out later from him he had simultaneously sent the same package to 6 different publishers. But my editor-in-chief at the time, Dave Schreiner, and I immediately responded. And he said he never heard from the other 5, and it always astonished me because I don't think they ever looked at their slush pile. If you were a bigger company, your lowest intern would take that stuff, put it back in the return envelope, and mail it. Nobody was really taking it seriously. And I always thought there's going to be a diamond in the rough, and that was the first real diamond.
Now, did that start in Death Rattle?
Yes. I wanted to test the market, so we put him in an established title, and once it proved popular, then we gave him his own series, and we naively announced it as a bi-monthly. And Mark's, if you know his work, meticulous craftsman, he's lucky he can do one a year. So
I think I think there were like 15 issues total.
Probably 15 in a dozen years, probably.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so we're at the 40-minute mark, which is where we can then open up the floor to questions. So we got a question over here.
What was it like interacting with Richard Corbin?
Okay, so I'm supposed to repeat the questions, by the way.
Sorry.
So the recording. So what was it like to interact with Richard Corbin?
I only saw Richard in person once. He was kind of a hermit. He never left Kansas City, very seldom. But he was easy to work with, I found. His stuff was unique. He did his own color separations through a mysterious process. So every other cover we got, we treated in a certain mechanical manner, but his came as film that he had made himself. So he was technically on a different level than anyone else. And I guess the only problem I had with Richard was he was so good that bigger publishers could pay him more, and so he ended up doing work largely for other publishers, but I always thought he was wonderful.
Thank you.
Ian, you had your hand up.
Yeah. Do you think that starting in Milwaukee, away from sort of these central hubs of what we consider these central hubs of the comics industry, do you feel like that gave you a unique vantage point or any sort of advantage over your competition or the other publishing agencies you're working against?
Okay, so the question's about starting out in Milwaukee, giving you a unique vantage point.
The answer is absolutely yes, and I'll give you a specific example. So there were 4, we jokingly said the big 4, because the auto industry was the big 4. So we had in San Francisco and Berkeley, you had Last Gasp, Ripoff Press, Print Mint, and then I was the sole outlier in Wisconsin. And what I found very quickly was I was getting stuff in the mail and offers for books from San Francisco cartoonists. And I remember thinking to myself, they could walk a few blocks from where they live. Why are they sending stuff to me? So I found out later, when I went to San Francisco, that it was politics. People sleeping with each other, people hating each other. I'll never work for that guy again. He screwed me, blah, blah, blah. So I was the neutral party. It was definitely an advantage. And I remember, you know, Bill Griffith actually gave me a chart that I think I still have, and he had broken down all the cliques. And so it was like, he said, okay, there's like the science fiction guys like Corbin, there's the Midwest guys like Jay Lynch, Skip Williamson, there's the women, they were just one group. I forget, he had broken down, and then he said, then there's me and himself and Art Spiegelman and Justin Green and Kim Deitch. And he said, we're the pretentious assholes. But there was only Trina and Sherry Flanagan and a few women relative to the men, and so there was a lot of back and forth, girlfriend, boyfriend stuff, and then you'd break up, and then you didn't want to work with that person again or do a book with that person again. So yes, being in Milwaukee, I was above the fray in a totally unpredictable way.
Missed out on some common girlfriends, though, I guess.
Other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I think I once knew this, but I forgot. You mentioned the time that Joe Warren took away the spirit. And I remember I came across one of your undergrounds, and I was really excited about it. And then the next thing I knew, it was a Warren magazine, and I found your other issue. But so, what was the story on that? Were you planning to keep Spirit in that format, or maybe do something with it?
Well, the short answer is, when I convinced Will that I should do the Spirit, the contract allowed me 2 issues, and then it would be reconsidered. So I sold 20,000 copies of each issue, which was pretty good, kind of typical for an underground in those days. And when Jim Warren saw it, Jim was a big fan of Will's, and he had newsstand distribution with his magazine. So he went to Will and he just literally said, look, I can print 100 to 200,000 copies, get you newsstand distribution, pay you X times more. And Will looked at it as a businessman, and he said, all right, let's do it. He called me and he said, I'm going to do this for practical reasons, but he said, I'm sure we'll work together again. So after a couple of years, again, I think, I want to speak unkindly of Jim Warren, but he's not an easy guy to get along with either. And I think he and Will just kind of had disagreements. And so Will canceled that agreement after, I think, 16 issues. And he called me and he said, do you think there's any life left in the Spirit? And I said, oh yeah. So we picked up the magazine, I think number 17. I think it went to issue number 41, and then we divided it up and we made a Spirit comic book in chronological order, and then Will Eisner's Quarterly was a chance for him to develop new work that led to graphic novels. So it all worked out well, and so brief divorce that we remarried.
Thanks for that question about the Spirit, because that just reminded me of something else. When you talked about splitting, it's Spirit and Will Eisner Quarterly, because the Spirit magazine also started to include a lot of Eisner's non-Spirit stuff, right? What went into the decision to first start publishing? Was it Life on Another Planet or Signal from Space as those those kind of inserts that you had to cut out of the comic in order to read.
That was Will's idea, and I tried to explain to him collectors would not cut up this magazine and refold it. And when he heard it from enough retailers and fans, and he realized, okay, he had misjudged. He was not a collector himself, so he didn't understand what the big deal is cutting up your magazine. I said, no, Will, they want to read them and then put them in these plastic bags and put them in white boxes. We had to educate him.
Other questions? Yeah, Ian, go ahead.
Did you find any other big names in those slush piles, or you mentioned that about 90% of them were garbage? What about 10%?
So a question about the other gems found in the slush piles.
Well, I think yes, but I mean, it would be people like, say, Joe Matt, just somebody totally unknown, and you know. But I also have to say, I did not have a perfect track record. In the course of preparing all these papers for Columbia, I saw I had rejected a young cartoonist named Chris Ware. Didn't think he was quite there. There were a number of, Jason Lutz was another one who went on to do Berlin, which was amazing. But you see artists usually young in a formative state, and my eye and my editor's eye would be, okay, this person's almost there, but they need a little more work. And if we publish them now, it's premature. And sometimes that's the smart decision, but you run the risk then that 6 months later they've gotten there, only this time they sent it to Fantagraphics or somebody else. So, you know, it's an imperfect science. And you have to trust your eye and you have to trust your gut. And more often than not, I think I had a good track record, but it certainly was not perfect.
Okay. We have time for maybe one more short question. Yep.
Aside from the underground stuff, how did the relationships with like Milton Caniff and Al Cap start?
Okay. How did the relationships with other creators like Milton Caniff and Al Cap start?
Well, I was always a fan of the classic comics, so just because I was a pot-smoking hippie didn't mean I couldn't enjoy the classic comics from previous decades. And I couldn't find collections of this work, and so I just thought it worked with the spirit, let's do it with others. And so fortunately, some of these classic creators are still alive, like Milton Caniff. He was an amazing gentleman to work with. We did Steve Canyon because he controlled that. Terry and the Pirates had become public domain, and so at least 2, maybe 3 publishers had already collected that. But getting to work with him directly was a pleasure. My editor of that, Pete Poplaski, would interview him deeply in each issue, and so it was more than just reprints. It was editorial and historical context for each issue. And Al Cap, I never met. I talked on the phone with him, but I mean, he's a piece of work. That's a panel in itself. But after he died, I ended up getting the rights to reprint Little Abner, and did 27 volumes and only got halfway through before Kitchen Sink finally ended. So that would have been a real encyclopedic set. So I viewed him as a kind of a genius cartoonist, but a snake of a human being. But most of the classics, the artists had died. Like, I love Nancy, but Ernie Bushmiller, I couldn't reach. When I did Alley Oop, V.T. Hamlin was in a nursing home. And when I talked to the syndicate, I asked if he would get any of the money from the Alley Oop royalties, and the woman on the phone said, let me check, and she came back and read a form letter to me that as an employee of the syndicate, he would not get any. So we got him to sign plates for the hardcovers, and in handwriting that was very feeble. He got paid for that and got to actually have this limited edition with a signature just before he passed. So there are pretty sweet stories like that, but I wish I had just started earlier, right away, when more of these classic cartoonists were around, but it wasn't practical at the very beginning.
Well, that's kind of the end of our time here, so thanks everybody for coming, and thanks Dennis for a great conversation. Happy.
Thank you. And they tell me I have a signing now, so if anybody has any other questions, I'm happy to talk while I'm at the signing table.